Let the candles flicker. Let the wind hum through stone corridors. Tonight, we drift back through time. To when stone was king, and walls could breathe. Before the crack of dawn, before the lords stirred in their feather beds and before the blacksmith struck iron, there stood castles. Not the fairy tale kind, but massive, bone-chilling, earth-bound beasts of stone. Silent by day. Alive by siege. Perched atop wind-swept hills and deep within fog-soaked valleys, these castles weren't just homes. They were fortresses. Symbols of power. Arteries of control. And when they were threatened, when enemy banners appeared on the horizon, they became battlegrounds of will, endurance, and fear. But let us not begin with war. Let us begin with the castle itself. Picture it. The grey mist rises, clinging to the battlements like a second skin. The guards pace slowly above on the parapets, eyes squinting into the trees. Below, in the still sleeping courtyard, the stones remember the weight of countless boots. The rhythm of commerce, cooking, and prayer. Yet today feels different. A quiet tension coils through the air, like a bowstring pulled taut. Something is coming. These castles were built for moments like this. Their design wasn't by accident. Every stone, every arch, every narrow winding stair crafted with siege in mind. The walls were thick not just to hold out cold, but to deflect arrows, to resist fire, to outlast hunger and time. Gatehouses were death traps. Spiral staircases turned clockwise so defenders descending could swing swords freely, while attackers, ascending, found their weapon hands pressed to the wall. Arrow slits, those thin, cruel eyes in the stone, allowed archers to rain death with nearly no exposure. This was a world where defense was art. And in the Middle Ages, it was a necessity. By the late 11th century, Europe was laced with castles. Not hundreds. Thousands. Built first of wood, then stone, each one reflected its lord's wealth, fears, and ambition. A place to sleep, yes, but more so, a place to not die. Because survival was never guaranteed. Bandits. Rival lords. Rebellious peasants. Vikings. Normans. Mongols. Turks. Enemies wore many faces, and siege was their favorite language. A siege wasn't an instant explosion. It was a slow, choking ritual. A test of patience, both for those outside and within. Inside, it began with whispers. A merchant returned from a nearby village saw strange soldiers crossing fields. A scout, breathless, reported unfamiliar banners on the road. The Lord, weary-eyed, climbed the tower to look for himself. And there, like dark birds on the horizon, banners fluttering in the wind. Siege engines. Men with shields. Lines of spears like forests moving slowly. Outside the castle, the world was preparing for siege. Inside, time stopped. The gates were sealed. The drawbridge pulled. Chickens gathered. Rain barrels filled. Arrows counted. Oil warmed. This wasn't a battle that would last hours. This was a contest of weeks, months, sometimes years. Inside, every heartbeat counted. Outside, every day was a step toward starvation, disease, or surrender. This was the slow apocalypse of the Middle Ages. Imagine a child peering from a window. She sees her favorite pasture now churned with enemy boots. She sees her father trying to calm the villagers. She doesn't understand yet, but soon, she will learn what it means when the bread runs out. Imagine the priest. Kneeling. Praying. whispering Latin invocations by candlelight as war drums echo through stone. Imagine the cook counting sacks of grain, knowing that today's stew must feed 50. And next week's stew may be broth flavored with bark. This was siege. A test of who would break first, the wall, the body, or the soul. The first arrows would come fast. Shot not to kill, but to scare. A warning. Then came the rocks, hurled by trebuchets that groaned like giants. The whistling air before impact. The shudder of stone walls absorbing rage. Sometimes dead animals were flung, rotting pigs, diseased corpses intended not to breach the wall, but the body. Disease was a favorite attacker. Still, the castle held. And inside, life continued. Marriages happened during siege. So did births. So did death from simple coughs or fevers, worsened by hunger and fear. Siege life was claustrophobic. Boredom bred madness. Hope eroded. But the castle walls, thick, mighty, aching with history, kept standing. For now. And so ends our first chapter. The castle, a breathing monument of stone, has locked its doors. Outside waits an enemy. Inside, beats 1,000 anxious hearts. This is not a story of glory. It is a story of endurance. Of stone against time. Of fear against will. In our next chapter, we meet the attackers. The engineers. The mercenaries. The kings who believe no wall should defy them. But tonight, let the stone speak. Let the wind pass through arrow slits and empty halls. Let the siege begin. Beneath the bannered sky, they came. Not as a thunderstorm, but as creeping fog. Not to conquer in a day, but to wait, and starve you from the inside out. From the moment a castle was born, someone was dreaming of how to break it. To storm a fortress wasn't just warfare, it was chess. It was theater. It was patience wrapped in violence. And so, let us step outside the walls. Let us walk among the besiegers. Not monsters. Not always heroes. But craftsmen of chaos. Engineers. Alchemists. Mercenaries. Men paid in coin and glory to turn a castle into a coffin. First came the scouts. Silent riders, slipping through woods, counting the towers. Measuring the land. Noting where the terrain dipped or where the stone looked weakest. A siege could not be rushed. Not if it was to be won. Then came the camp. Imagine it, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of tents rising like a city of war. Canvas flapping in the wind. Iron clanging from the forges. Carts of lumber arriving daily. Wagons of tar. Barrels of pitch. Ropes. Stones. Meat. Water. Wine. And men. Men from everywhere. Mercenaries from the Holy Roman Empire. Archers from Wales. Crossbowmen from Genoa. Hardened warriors, men with one eye and no stories left to tell. But before swords were drawn, before fire touched the walls, there was strategy. A siege was never just attack. It was starve, scare, isolate, break. And so the commanders gathered around maps by candlelight, whispering of wells, grain stores, escape tunnels. Every castle had a weakness. It was their job to find it. Siege engineers were the rock stars of medieval war. They didn't wield swords. They built nightmares. And their tools instruments of dreadful elegance, the trebuchet, the giant S-arm. A wooden behemoth, counterweighted to hurl boulders, fire pots, or plague-ridden corpses through the air. Ballistae, giant crossbows firing bolts the size of spears. Belfries, tall, mobile towers, rolled close to the walls to allow warriors to storm over the top. Mining tunnels, dug beneath walls to collapse them with fire and timber. To the besieger, time was their weapon. They could wait longer than the defenders could eat. And wait, they did. Sometimes for months. Through snow. Through heat. Through sickness in their own camps. For while the castle may have been a prison to its defenders, the siege camp was no paradise. Rotting food. Boiled water. Infighting among mercenaries. Letters from home that never arrived. A siege drained both sides. Slowly. Cruelly. Let us now walk beside one such commander. A grizzled French lord, once a knight in the Crusades. He stands on a hill, staring down at the castle below. He knows that one clean assault might cost him 300 men. But hunger is free. So he waits. Every day, he sends a single volley. A flaming cart. A dead mule. Just enough to keep the defenders afraid. Every week, he sends a messenger to offer surrender. And every week, they refuse. But one day, they will not. Now imagine a siege that's gone too long. The troops are restless. Supplies low. Disease has taken the horses. The enemy inside still hasn't broken. The commander orders the final option. The assault. Trumpets blast. Drums thunder. The earth quakes. Siege towers roll forward like wooden mountains. Ladders are raised. Arrows blacken the sky. The castle bell tolls wildly. Boiling oil is poured. Stones hurled. Men scream. Steel clashes. Some fall before even reaching the wall. Others climb, only to be pushed back with bloodied faces. And some make it inside. Just a few. That's all it takes. Because once the gate is open, the castle becomes a tomb. The defenders fall. The Lord surrenders or dies with sword in hand. The people they weep. Some beg. Some run. And the besiegers they flood in like a tide of fire. But not every siege ends in violence. Some end with silence. A white flag. A parley. A deal made by candlelight. Because to survive is not always to win. And surrender, though bitter, is sometimes the only door left open. And what of the siege engineers, the crossbowmen, the mercenaries? They pack their tools. They drink their final wine. They move to the next fortress. To do it all again. You see, a siege was never just a battle of weapons. It was a war of endurance. Of mind over body. Of patience over impulse. To break a castle was to break its soul slowly, strategically, without mercy. And yet, for every castle that fell, another rose. Stronger. Taller. Wiser. As if the stones themselves had learned. In our next chapter, we'll walk inside the walls once more. We'll feel the tension of dwindling food. We'll hear the prayers of the weak and the plotting of the brave. And we'll explore what truly happened behind those cold, stone walls. When all you had left was time, fear, and hope. Outside, the drums of war echo like distant thunder. But inside the walls there is only silence. The kind of silence that presses against your chest. The kind that listens, waits, and watches as the days grow colder, and the food runs thin. When the gates were sealed and the drawbridge raised, life within a besieged castle changed forever. The world shrank. From vast fields and open skies, to stone corridors, shadowed stairwells, and anxious whispers. Every person became part of a fragile machine, turning together, or breaking apart. Let us begin in the great hall. Once a place of feasts and laughter, it is now crowded with peasants and townsfolk. Sheltering beneath tapestries, huddled in corners, children clinging to mothers. The Lord sits on his elevated seat, no longer a symbol of power, but of responsibility. Every decision now costs a life, a ration, a chance at surviving one more day. The steward approaches with the food ledger. Barrels of grain, 14. Wheels of cheese, 9. Salted meat, enough for a week if stretched. Water, contaminated near the stables. The castle has enough supplies, for now. But everyone knows, a siege is not measured in days. It is measured in how long you can last. Before you begin eating the horses. Then the dogs. Then, things you once vowed never to eat. Down in the kitchens, the fires burn lower. Servants stir thin soups, bulked with barley and old cabbage. Salt is precious. Honey is a memory. Every meal is a quiet moment of fear. A girl asks her mother if the siege will end tomorrow. Her mother says yes. She has said it every day for 3 weeks. The walls themselves become homes. Archers sleep beneath their battlements. Guards rotate shifts watching for movement from the enemy camp. A flare of torchlight. A strange shape near the trees. Sometimes, the enemy sends no arrows. Only silence. A silence so thick it makes your mind wander. Makes you imagine they be gone. Or worse, that they're planning something new. The chapel remains full. Old men pray with shaking hands. Nuns tend to the sick and the wounded. The priest, once just a Sunday voice, now offers daily blessings and funeral rites. There are more candles burning here than anywhere else in the castle. Not because it is dark, but because it is the only place left with hope. But not everyone prays. In the shadows of the cellar, there are meetings. Whispers. Arguments. Some say they should surrender. That no banner is worth starving over. Others call it treason. Loyalty and survival begin to blur. And trust, the invisible stone that holds a castle together, begins to crack. Now climb with me to the highest tower. The Lord's daughter stands here, wrapped in furs, her breath fogging in the winter air. She watches the horizon. The fires of the enemy camp glow orange in the distance. She wonders if her betrothed will come to rescue her. If her father still believes they can win. If the enemy has already bribed someone within these walls. She's read the stories. Not all sieges end with broken walls. Some end with opened gates. From the inside, time becomes the enemy. Each day blends into the next. The clatter of the blacksmith fades. The jokes in the barracks stop. Even the birds seem to have vanished. Only the bell rings each morning and evening. A reminder that they are still alive. That, somehow, the heart of the castle still beats. But hunger does not wait. Soon the horses are gone. Then the rats. Then the leather straps on shields, boiled into bitter broth. Children cry not from fear but from empty bellies. The elderly offer their meals to the young. Some don't wake the next morning. And still, no sign of relief. No flags on the hill. No thunder of allied hooves. Only the crows circling above. Then one night a breach. Not in the walls, but in the mind of a guard. He slips away from his post. Finds the storage room. Takes more than his share. He is caught. punished. Not because of greed, but because he broke the only thing they had left, order. When survival hangs by a thread, justice becomes cruel and swift. Even mercy must be rationed. And yet, somehow, some still believe. In the nursery, a boy draws on the wall with charcoal. He sketches a knight with a golden banner. He says, "That's my uncle. He is coming with a whole army." His mother doesn't correct him. Because sometimes, hope is more powerful than food. And easier to find. Then one morning, after 57 days, the bell rings early. The watchman shouts from the tower. Something stirs outside the walls. Not enemy movement, but silence. Real silence. The fires are gone. The siege towers abandoned. The camp, empty. The enemy has left. No battle. No final assault. Just the quiet withdrawal of a force that had grown tired. Or moved to a softer target. Relief floods the castle like spring rain. People cry. Laugh. Fall to their knees. The gates creak open. And the survivors step out, blinking in the sunlight. Changed forever. Some sieges end with blood. Others with surrender. But a few end with survival. And in a world where castles stood like defiant hearts against chaos, survival was the greatest victory of all. In the next chapter, we'll explore how siege warfare evolved. How castles themselves began to change. Growing stronger, smarter, more cunning. And how the arms race between stone and steel gave birth to some of history's most terrifying siege weapons. The castle stands not as a home but as a challenge and insult in stone to any force that dares to conquer it. So when armies marched against its walls, they did not come with swords alone. They brought logic sharpened into timber, physics wound into rope, and desperation given shape in towering machines. This chapter is not merely about weapons. It is about the transformation of raw thought into force. About the medieval mind bending nature itself to hurl judgment against stone. We begin with the most elegant of horrors, the trebuchet. A cathedral to gravity. To speak of siege warfare without naming the trebuchet is like whispering of storms without rain. No weapon more fully embodied the genius and the madness of medieval engineering. The counterweight trebuchet did not merely attack a castle. It humiliated it. It stood tall, proud, mathematical. A giant lever, powered not by fire or flame but by gravity itself, a force ancient as the stars. 1,000 pounds of weight, suspended in a box, fell silently. A sling unwound. And with a whisper, a boulder sailed through the sky like a divine accusation. At the siege of Stirling, Edward I built one so vast and terrible the defenders surrendered before it fired. He made them wait. He wanted to see it speak. The stone arced in stately silence. No whirring, no cry, just inevitability. That was its true terror. The trebuchet didn't scream. It declared. Battering rams, the pulse beneath the walls. If the trebuchet was subtlety, the battering ram was certainty. Its rhythm was heartbeat. Its language was repetition. Set beneath a canopy soaked in brine and hide, the ram moved with slow violence. It was not a blow, it was a sentence passed by time. Hour after hour, the beam would swing forward, strike, and retreat like the tide. The gate would shudder. Then again. And again. The defenders knew the sound well. It did not panic, it wore them down. Sometimes, the tip of the ram was shaped like a beast, an iron bull or a snarling ram's head capped to crush and demoralize. And while men pushed from behind, others stood atop the canopy, shielding their comrades with boards and arrows, as if protecting a sacred right. To hear a ram against your gate was to hear fate knock. Siege towers, rolling ambitions of men. Some weapons were not content to strike walls. They wished to ascend them. Siege towers were monstrosities of ambition, wooden cities on wheels, layered with platforms, crawling with soldiers, archers, and engineers. They trundled across fields like giants in a slow, deadly pilgrimage. They were clad in wet hides to resist fire, their sides peppered with arrow slits to return fire. As they neared the walls, drawbridges would unfold from the tower's upper deck, forming a ghastly tongue that reached out to lick the battlements. To see one approach was to witness the arrogance of man believing he could build his own hill to rival a mountain. Ladders and grapples, the desperate ascent. Where siege towers were the pride of engineers, ladders and grappling hooks were the tools of madmen and heroes. These were weapons of faith, not strategy. Faith in one's grip. In the absence of fire above. In the hope that your comrades reached the wall beside you. To climb a ladder under enemy fire is to walk vertically into death. Yet they did. Because sometimes, it worked. Sometimes, in the fog or under the shroud of moonlight, it was just enough. Hooks bit into battlements. Ropes coiled like serpents. And soldiers climbed toward uncertainty. Undermining, the war below the war. Not all siegecraft echoed in the air. Some whispered beneath the soil. Undermining was a long, silent death. Sappers dug tunnels under walls, propped them with timber, and filled the chambers with pitch and fat. When the fire was lit, the supports collapsed. And then, the wall followed. The earth groaned. The masonry cracked. And without warning, the proud wall slumped like a dying beast. Castles countered with countermines, sometimes meeting enemy sappers underground. Imagine it, men fighting in tunnels, in total blackness, inches from collapse. A war beneath the war. No poetry there. Just grit. And the creak of the ground shifting. The psychology of the projectile. Siege weapons did more than break stone. They broke men. They hurled not just rocks, but messages, rotting carcasses to spread plague, severed heads to taunt the living, or scrolls wrapped around flaming pitch. In some sieges, prisoners were flung back over the walls, torn and ruined, but marked with defiance. Sound itself became a weapon. The drum beat of the ram. The thrum of tensioned ropes. The deep, sickening impact of stone on tower. And always the silence before. The breathless moment when a castle waited for the next tremor. Craftsman of chaos. Behind each machine was a man who understood the math. Siege engines were not thrown together, they were drawn, calculated, tested. Engineers studied Roman treatises, measured lever arms, adjusted sling lengths to fractions of a handspan. Blacksmiths forged joints. Rope makers twisted coils for weeks. Carpenters built towers that would never return home. These were not warmongers. They were builders, conscripted by kings, wielding genius in the service of destruction. Sometimes, they died beside their machines. Other times, they lived long enough to see their inventions change the course of history. The siege engine as monument. Each trebuchet, each ram, each ladder was more than a tool. It was a statement. A thesis written in timber, arguing that no wall is eternal. Some engines were built only once. Others were burned in retreat. But they left behind no shortage of ghosts, shattered gates, crumbled towers, fire-blackened stones that remember the day the sky fell. And in quiet valleys today, beneath grassy mounds where castles once stood, one might still imagine the slow roll of wheels, the tightening of ropes, the whispered count before release, and then silence shattered. The walls of a medieval castle were thick with mortar and stone, yes. But they were also thick with secrets. During a siege, they did not simply hold back an enemy. They held in something far more volatile, the human soul under pressure. Beyond the battlements, when the drawbridge rose and the gates groaned shut, another siege began, not of catapults and battering rams, but of time, of patience, of hunger. This is the tale not of armies, but of the besieged, the defenders, the civilians, the cooks, the children, and the castellan. A world shrinking by the hour, held captive by uncertainty and the echo of distant drums. The first days, courage and routine. At first, there was structure. A calm sense of preparedness. The garrison checked the oil stocks and arrow stores. Cooks inventoried salt pork and barley. Priests led prayers at dawn and dusk. Everyone had a role. Hope was still alive, flickering, yes, but real. Children peered through slits in the stone, marveling at the distant siege towers being assembled like wooden giants. Nobles feigned composure. The castle steward distributed food with calculated generosity. The defenders practiced on the walls, calling down taunts to their attackers. It was still a game. Still noble. Still survivable. But the days grew longer. And then, things began to change. Rationing and rot. The most dangerous weapon in a siege was not always forged from iron. It was time. As the siege dragged on, rations thinned. The smell of rot crept into granaries. Grain became dust. Rats found the bread before children did. Cheese turned green, then black. Salted fish floated in barrels of brine, soft and shriveled. Butter melted and spoiled. Wine soured. Barley was hoarded like gold. The kitchens were no longer places of aroma but of anxiety. Pots simmered with less each day, thin stews made thicker with boiled leather, bark, or weeds pulled from between stone cracks. And yet, still, the people hoped. Disease in the darkness. When people are trapped in tight quarters, the walls do more than keep out arrows. They keep in sickness. Typhoid. Dysentery. Pox. These were enemies no knight could strike down. The latrines overflowed. Wells grew foul. The same bucket served too many mouths. Children coughed in their sleep. Wounds festered. Even the strong grew pale. And still, the priest led prayer, incense rising like hope through the cold chapel air. Bodies were buried in the gardens. Sometimes, not buried at all. Whispers started. Of poison. Of punishment. Of divine wrath. The siege turned from physical to psychological. The defenders at the wall. While the castle suffered, the soldiers remained on the battlements. They did not merely defend a wall, they defended the illusion that all was still within control. Each morning, they rotated shifts. Arrows were counted and carefully loosed. Cauldrons of boiling water were kept hot. Oil was conserved for critical moments. Even dung, hot and steaming, was weaponized. They watched the enemy, always building, always creeping closer. Sometimes they fired first, to remind the besiegers that courage still lived within the walls. Sometimes they said nothing, only staring with eyes hollowed by fatigue. The wall was not their shield. It was their burden. The mental siege. Silence is a terrible sound in a siege. The absence of battle was more chilling than its fury. It meant the enemy was waiting. Listening. Or worse, digging. Every creak of stone might mean a mine below. Every shadow might conceal a flame. The psychological warfare grew intense. The besiegers might catapult severed heads over the wall not to kill, but to haunt. Sometimes diseased bodies were flung in, swaddled in filth, to rot in the sunlit courtyards. And inside, people began to change. Mothers hushed crying babies with trembling hands. Lovers whispered plans of escape. The strong grew quiet. The weak grew desperate. Faith was tested. And so was loyalty. The question of betrayal. In every siege, there comes a moment when the wall is no longer the greatest threat. It is the people within it. Betrayal became the whisper behind every door. Who would open the gate for a promise of gold? Who had family among the attackers who grew tired enough to trade a key for a crust of bread? Sometimes, the enemy promised mercy. Other times, they offered nothing but certainty: surrender, or starve. Castle commanders faced impossible choices. Share the dwindling bread with the common folk or hoard it for the garrison. Tension built like steam. All it needed was a crack. The Castellan's dilemma. At the center of every besieged castle stood a man or woman with an impossible burden, the Castellan, the keeper of the stronghold. They were not merely military leaders. They were stewards of despair. Each day, they walked the halls, their face carved from stone. They listened to reports of spoiled grain, of wells gone dry, of infants grown too quiet. They wrote letters, sealed with wax, and sent pigeons to allies begging for relief that might never come. And when the time came when hope was wrung dry, they faced a choice: hold until death, surrender and pray for mercy, or launch a desperate sortie. None were noble. All were costly. The siege within. By the final days, a castle became a prison of its own making. The gates remained shut not out of strength, but out of habit. The walls that once symbolized power now echoed with suffering. People spoke less. They moved less. They aged in hours. The once proud halls were silent but for the scrape of spoons on empty bowls, the weeping of mothers, and the scratching of rats. And then drums. A call to parley. Or the roar of fire as a tower fell. Or the horn blast of a relieving army on the horizon. Every siege ended. But the scars inside those walls, they lingered. While war has always been a brutal teacher, the medieval siege was also a classroom of astonishing innovation. For all the mud and blood, the siege ground was where engineering met desperation, where physics collided with strategy, and where imagination twisted though it might be shaped the fate of kingdoms. This was not just war. This was siegecraft. From the hurling of stones to the tunneling of earth, from monstrous machines to psychological torment, the attackers outside the castle walls became artists in their own dark discipline. Let us now walk among their camps, listen to the groaning of war machines, and observe how they slowly, methodically, dismantled the invincibility of stone. The trebuchet, gravity's relentless hammer. No siege weapon captured the imagination or terror of the medieval world like the trebuchet. Towering like a wooden god, the trebuchet was a marvel of counterweight engineering. A heavy load of rocks or lead was hoisted skyward, and when released, it yanked down one arm of the massive lever, launching a sling that could hurl a 300-pound stone over 300 yards. But this wasn't just brute force. This was mathematics. Engineers calibrated each throw, adjusting the counterweight, the sling length, and the projectile size. Some siege crews took pride in precision strikes, aiming to collapse walls with surgical accuracy or even fling stones through the same window again and again, like knocking on death's door. In some sieges, plague-ridden corpses were launched instead of stones, turning the trebuchet into a biological weapon. And perhaps most chillingly, the defenders could do nothing but watch the slow arc of destruction approach again and again and again. Siege towers, the moving mountains. For walls too high to scale and too thick to break, there was the siege tower, a mobile wooden fortress, sometimes several stories tall, armored in wet hides to resist fire. Inside, ladders, archers, and battering crews prepared for the final push. As the tower creaked forward on massive wheels, defenders would rain fire and arrows upon it. But if it reached the wall, the nightmare began. A drawbridge at the top would slam down onto the battlements, and out surged the attackers, face to face with the defenders in desperate hand-to-hand combat. To see a siege tower approaching was to witness inevitability. Slow, groaning, enormous, it was not a weapon. It was a sentence. Undermining the war beneath the earth. Sometimes the greatest threat came from below. Miners, often conscripted or paid in gold, dug tunnels beneath the enemy's walls. With pickaxe and torch, they carved the earth, propping up the tunnels with timber beams. Their goal: collapse the wall by removing its foundation. Once the tunnel was complete, the beams were set ablaze, the tunnel collapsed, and if done right, the wall above it came crashing down in a shattering roar of dust and ruin. It was dirty, dangerous, and slow. The defenders often countered with counter mines, listening to the underground scraping, trying to intercept the attackers before the fatal moment. In some sieges, underground duels were fought in darkness, pickaxe against sword, both sides choking on smoke and fear. Ladders, rams, and siege hooks. Not every siege could afford giants. Many relied on simplicity. Wooden ladders, carried by brave or desperate men, allowed small-scale assaults on the walls. Defenders poured boiling oil, dropped stones, and slashed at hands as they reached over the parapets. Battering rams, shielded beneath wooden structures called tortoises, pounded at the gates in rhythmic fury. Some rams had iron heads shaped like beast spores, dragons, or bull, symbols of strength. Siege hooks were used to tear down sections of wall or pull down wooden defenses. These tools required the attackers to get too close. These were the weapons of the grunts, the foot soldiers, the expendable. But every wall crack begins with their courage. The role of engineers and craftsmen. Behind every weapon, there were minds at work: engineers, carpenters, smiths, and masons. Siege warfare was not just about brawn, but brains. Engineers measured wall thickness, wind direction, soil softness. They calculated sling trajectories and stress loads. Blacksmiths forged iron bolts for giant crossbows called ballistae. Carpenters crafted massive wheels, joints, and axle systems. Siege weapons had to be built on site, transported in pieces, assembled in mud and rain, and protected from sabotage or fire. A failed trebuchet could doom a siege. A jammed ram could cost hundreds of lives. The craftsman's hammer and compass, in these moments, were just as deadly as the knight's sword. Psychological warfare and deception. Siegecraft was not always about brute strength, it was about breaking the will of those inside the castle. Attackers played mind games. They shout lies over the walls: your king is dead. Help will never come. They march prisoners before the gates. They stage false retreats to draw out defenders. Some besiegers created mock towns just outside the castle, building huts, cooking food, playing music to signal that they had no intention of leaving. That they had all the time in the world. The defenders, watching from above, saw not an army but a civilization slowly replacing their own. Fire, the great equalizer. And then, of course, there was fire. Whether launched in clay pots, smeared on arrows, or poured as boiling pitch, fire could reduce years of fortification to rubble in hours. Castles made of wood or even with wooden interior structures were highly vulnerable. Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary used by the Byzantines, could burn even on water. Its formula was so closely guarded that it died with its empire. During sieges, fire was feared more than swords. It leapt over walls, through windows, into granaries and stables. And once it caught, it consumed everything. Even hope. Siege logistics, the army outside. It is easy to picture the castle. But what of the men who lived outside it? The besieging army had its own world, a sprawling camp of tents, wagons, kitchens, and latrines. Fields were cleared. Roads were dug. Moats were drained. Feeding thousands of soldiers for months took immense planning. Supply lines stretched for miles, vulnerable to ambush or weather. Spoilage, mutiny, disease, they could all turn a siege into suicide. Commanders had to keep morale high. Soldiers, idle for long stretches, grew restless. Fights broke out. Desertion was common. And always, they stared up at the castle, wondering who would break first. Conclusion: brilliance in brutality. Siege warfare was not merely battle. It was ritual, art, and calculation. It was humanity at its most ingenious, and most desperate. The machines they built were extraordinary. The tactics they employed were brilliant. But the purpose was always the same: to force the will of one group onto another. Each trebuchet stone, each burning arrow, each echoing ram was not just a weapon. It was a message. You cannot hold out forever. We will not leave. You will break. And in time, many did. Inside the thick stone walls of a besieged castle, a very different kind of war was being fought. Not with swords or trebuchets, but with time, patience, hunger, and fear. While the attackers outside hammered and plotted, the people inside endured. They were not merely defenders, they were prisoners in their own fortress. The very walls that once promised safety had become the bars of a grand stone cage. This chapter opens the heavy doors to that forgotten world, the siege within. The first days, hope and preparation. In the early days of a siege, there is still hope. Watchmen on the battlements scan the distant hills for signs of relief. Messengers who fled before the siege began may yet return with allies. Priests offer prayers in the chapel. Lords hold councils. The castle's defenders organize rations, arm the garrison, and seal the outer gates. There is a tense energy, almost excitement. Inside the keep, stockpiles of salted meat, beans, and grain are opened. Carts of firewood are rationed. Water barrels are checked. Wells are tested. Even the latrines are inspected. Nothing may be wasted now. But beneath the order, beneath the ceremony and resolve, a quiet question stirs in every heart: how long can we last rationing and hunger? No matter how strong the walls are, the true test of a castle's endurance lies in its pantry. Once the siege drags past days into weeks, rationing begins. Meat becomes rare. Bread is stretched with ground-up bark or acorns. Porridge is made thin. Livestock, if not already slaughtered, is fed sparingly or sacrificed for one final feast before the famine sets in. The grain stores are locked, guarded like treasure. Peasants, soldiers, nobles all feel the bite of hunger. Class may determine the size of one's bowl, but not the gnawing in one's belly. As months pass, the stories grow darker. There are tales whispered of rats roasted on spits, of dogs boiled in cauldrons, of belts softened in broth, even of darker things, too terrible to speak aloud. In the end, it is not the sword that brings a castle to its knees, it is the hollow stomach. disease and death in tight quarters. A besieged castle is crowded. Refugees from surrounding farms have fled inside its walls. The healthy share space with the wounded. Straw mattresses are crammed into storage rooms. Families sleep in corners. Children cry through the night. There is no fresh air. No escape. Disease breeds like wildfire. Dysentery, spread through tainted water and poor sanitation, is common. A single contaminated well can doom hundreds. Lice, fleas, and rats thrive in the filth. Wounds fester. Fevers burn. There are no field hospitals. Only crude bandages, boiling water, and prayer. The dead must be buried inside the walls or left in makeshift pits. The smell of death becomes part of the air. So too does the sound of mourning. In some castles, mass graves were dug even before the siege began because everyone knew they would be needed. Fear and fatigue on the walls. The defenders, archers, knights, men at arms stand on the walls, day after day, waiting. Every sound in the night, every clatter or horn from the enemy camp sends them scrambling into position. Sleep comes in snatches. Meals are eaten on watch. Armor is rarely removed. Some lose fingers to frostbite in the cold. Others are crushed by falling stones or struck by arrows. And yet they keep watch, because to sleep too long is to die. Each morning, they look across the battlefield and see that the enemy is still there. Still camped. Still watching. And worse than the siege engines, is the silence. When nothing happens for days, the tension becomes unbearable. They know that at any moment, the assault could begin and they must be ready. Always ready. The people's perspective, helpless and forgotten. Not all inside the castle are soldiers. Most are villagers, families, farmers, craftsmen who took shelter when the attack came. For them, the siege is a long, slow unraveling. Their homes outside the walls have likely been burned. Their crops trampled. Their animals stolen or eaten. Now, they live in barns, basements, and storerooms. Cold. Hungry. Afraid. Mothers hush children. Fathers beg the garrison for food. Elders pray for mercy. They are not warriors. They cannot fight. They cannot leave. And yet they suffer the most. In many sieges, resentment grows between the garrison and the civilians. Fights break out. Bread is stolen. Accusations fly. Sometimes the Lord must choose feed the soldiers, or feed the people in the end. Every siege breaks the soul of a place, not just its stones. Faith and rituals in desperation. In moments of despair, the chapel becomes a haven. Candles burn at all hours. Psalms are whispered. Statues are cleaned and kissed. Holy relics are brought out and paraded along the battlements. Priests lead processions, praying for divine intervention. Bells toll in defiance of death. It is said that in one famous siege, a bishop climbed the wall holding the bones of a saint, and the attackers dared not shoot. Faith becomes both sword and shield. When nothing else remains, belief endures. Whether it saves or merely delays the inevitable, no one can say. The noble household, strategy, pride, and surrender. At the heart of the castle lies its lord or lady, surrounded by retainers and advisors. To them falls the impossible task: decide how long to hold, when to strike, and when to surrender. Honor demands resistance. But duty demands survival. To surrender too early is shameful. But to hold too long may mean everyone inside perishes. Letters are written sometimes secretly to negotiate terms. Messengers risk death to slip past the walls. Flags of truce are raised. Talks are held at the gates. And always, the noble's pride hangs in the balance. History will remember what they chose. Will they be remembered as the defender who endured or the coward who gave in moments of humanity? Even within the gloom, there are flickers of light. A garrison captain sharing his own meal with a hungry child. A peasant woman patching a soldier's cloak. Two enemies shouting jokes across the wall. There are accounts rare but real of brief truces to retrieve the dead. Of songs sung between enemy camps at night. Of mercy shown, even in war. In these moments, we remember, behind every stone and sword was a human being, aching for peace. Conclusion: the true price of endurance. To live inside a besieged castle was to live on the edge of life itself. It was not merely a test of fortification but of character. Of community. Of the human spirit. For while the walls kept the enemy out, they could not keep suffering from coming in. And those who survived the siege would never be the same. When the gates finally opened, whether to victory or surrender, the people who stepped into the light did so not as conquerors, nor as cowards. They emerged as survivors. And in that, perhaps, lies the truest form of heroism. When patience runs dry, and words fail to bring surrender, the siege transforms. From a long, silent waiting game, to a roaring, brutal finale. This is the moment all sides dread and anticipate. The final assault, when strategy meets steel, and the stone walls that once stood proud begin to crumble beneath a storm of iron and fire. Here, in Chapter 8, we witness that terrible moment. When the siege breaks loose. A sky darkened with arrows. It begins not with a horn, but with silence. A pause in the morning mist. Men waiting at their stations. Archers bowing their heads in prayer. Then, suddenly movement. The first wave begins. A rain of arrows fills the sky, whistling like death's own song. Hundreds of bowstrings loose in unison. Some from the towers, others from siege towers rolled forward overnight. From the castle walls, archers respond. Arrow meets arrow. Shafts rattle against stone. The air becomes a battlefield all its own, filled with smoke, feathers, screams, and the dull thuds of men collapsing. To stand atop the wall in this moment is to stand between life and death with every breath. Siege towers and ladders, assault from below. Next come the towers. Massive wooden beasts, creaking forward on wheels. Covered in wet hides to resist flame, they roll toward the curtain walls like giants of war. Behind them, ladder men rush with tools and madness. Their job is simple: get over the wall, or die trying. From above, boiling water and flaming pitch are poured. Stones the size of pumpkins are dropped. Spears jab down like lightning. But still the towers move. When one finally reaches the wall, its bridge crashes down. And chaos spills into the battlements. The defenders rush to hold the breach. Steel against steel. Men pushed from ledges. The screams echo louder now, bouncing off the stone as if the castle itself is crying out. Battering rams and sappers, assault from beneath. While the eyes are drawn to the drama atop the walls, another war is being fought below. The main gate, often the strongest part of a castle, is assaulted by a beast of its own, the battering ram. Covered in thick wooden sheds, manned by scores of shielded soldiers, the ram slams against the great doors. Again and again and again. Thum. 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 Each strike shakes the castle like a heartbeat of doom. Meanwhile, sappers, miners with pickaxes and torches tunnel beneath the walls, trying to collapse entire towers from below. If successful, the ground gives way, and with a terrible groan of stone, part of the wall collapses, opening a wound in the fortress's flesh. Through that wound, the final storm begins. The breach, into the heart of the castle. Once the wall breaks, everything changes. No more waiting. No more distance. Now it is hand to hand. Face to face. Enemies meet on the same ground. No longer separated by ramparts or moats. Now, they fight in the courtyards. In the kitchens. In the stairwells. Children cry. Horses panic. The once orderly defenses fall to desperation. Torches are thrown into storage rooms. Barrels of oil are ignited. Smoke fills the halls. If the defenders refuse surrender, the invaders burn everything to the ground. If they are lucky, terms are offered. If not, there is slaughter. And mercy, if it comes late. Fire, the final weapon. Fire is often the final word in a siege. When the walls fall, and defenders retreat to inner keeps or towers, the attackers bring flame. Roofs collapse. Libraries burn. Chapels, once filled with prayer, turn to ash. Some castles were built to resist fire, but most were not. And in the confusion, even stone structures suffer. The smell of burning wood. The screams. The falling embers drifting like deadly snowflakes through the smoke. This is not just the end of a battle. It is the death of a place. The bell that never rang. In many castles, there was a great bell. Rung for weddings, funerals, and enemy approach. But during final assaults, there was no one left to ring it. In a haunting number of sieges, that bell was silenced. Either because the chapel was burning, or because the bell ringer had joined the dead. And so, the last moments passed without fanfare. Only fire and steel to mark the hour. The price of taking a castle. When the castle finally falls, the victors cheer. But it is not always triumph that follows. More often, it is looting, exhaustion, and grief. Gold is stolen. Food hoarded. Artworks shattered. Servants taken. Sometimes, the commander offers protection to civilians. Sometimes, he allows his men free rein for one night. The line between conquest and cruelty is thin and often crossed. Even the victors leave haunted. They sleep poorly for months. They see blood in their dreams. And they know. The next time, they may be the ones behind the wall. After the storm, smoke and silence. When the smoke clears, when the sounds of battle fade, and when the banners are lowered or replaced, what remains is silence. The castle stands, though scarred. Its walls are blood-stained. Its halls echo with absence. And in the center of it all, the ground still warm from fire, a single question hangs in the air: was it worth it? When the fires have gone out, and the sounds of steel are replaced by silence, a new struggle begins. Not one of conquest, but of survival. This is life after the siege. In Chapter 9, we walk through the ashes of once mighty fortresses, listen to the stories of those who survived, and witness how medieval communities rebuilt themselves. From the stone up. With sorrow in their hearts, but strength in their hands. The castle that no longer defended. A castle was meant to be a symbol of power, protection, and permanence. But after a siege, it often stood as something else. A broken monument to the price of ambition. Towers collapsed. Gates splintered. Roofs torn away by fire or bombardment. Sometimes only a shell remained, its great hall now home to rats, its chapel hollow and blackened. And yet, despite the ruin, people returned. Not for glory, not for power, but because it was home. The survivors, what was left behind. Those who survived a siege were never quite the same. They bore the memory of fire, the loss of kin, the sound of death echoing in stone corridors. Some had fought. Others had hidden. Many had simply endured. Children became quiet. Mothers aged too fast. Fathers walked the ruins with silent eyes, searching for tools, food, or the bodies of friends. The villagers outside the walls fared no better. Fields were burned. Cattle slaughtered or stolen. Wells poisoned. And yet, they began again. Because they had no choice. Rebuilding the walls, stone by stone. The first task after a siege was clear: repair the walls. Without protection, there could be no future. Masons and carpenters, often brought in from distant towns, worked with local survivors. Children carried buckets. Elders collected stones from the ruins. Every beam placed, every nail hammered, was an act of defiance against despair. Some castles took years to rebuild. Others never fully recovered. But the rebuilding itself was a form of healing. And the walls rose again. The church bells return. One of the first structures repaired after a siege was often the chapel. The people needed a place to mourn, to pray, to make sense of what had happened. The bell, once silent, was rehung. Its chime echoed through valleys again. Not as a warning, but as a sign that life had returned. It rang for funerals, yes, but also for baptisms, weddings, and simple Sunday prayers. Where once there was only fear, now there was remembrance. The new lords and their justice. In many sieges, the original lord was killed, exiled, or disgraced. And in his place came a new master. The one who had taken the castle. This new lord brought new laws, new taxes, and often, a heavy hand. Trust had to be earned or forced. Some tried to win the people with mercy. Others ruled with iron. Either way, the people had to adapt. Life after a siege wasn't just about stones and food. It was about learning how to live under new rule. How to rebuild families and customs. Under unfamiliar banners, scars that never healed. Even after the walls were whole, the fields green again, and laughter returned to the market square. The scars remained. Some were physical limbs lost, faces burned. Others were hidden deep inside. Fears that flickered every time a horn was blown in the distance, or when soldiers passed through. Stories were told in hushed tones. Children grew up sleeping with one ear open. And every generation remembered. Because someone always carried the memory forward. Legends born from fire. Over time, the siege passed from memory into legend. Bards turned bloodshed into songs. Tales of brave defenders, some true, some not, were shared by firesides. A girl who rang the bell until her hands bled. A cook who saved nobles by hiding them in barrels. A squire who held the gate with a broken sword. These legends became part of the land. They softened the pain, gave meaning to suffering, and reminded the people that even in the darkest days, light had not fully died. A new castle, a new chapter. In some places, the ruins were abandoned. The cost of rebuilding was too great. But in others, a new castle rose. Stronger. Taller. Smarter in design. Arrow slits were improved. Towers redesigned. Moats widened. The siege, in that way, had taught them. Each stone of the new fortress bore the lessons of the old. And with those stones came hope. Hope that if the enemy returned, the people would be ready. What a castle truly meant. In the end, the true strength of a castle was not its wall height, or gate width, or moat depth. It was the people inside it. Their ability to endure, to rebuild, to rise from ash and smoke, and build something stronger. A castle is not just stone. It is memory. It is will. It is the quiet courage of those who lived, and those who stayed behind to begin again. And in that, every siege had a purpose. Not just to test a castle's strength, but to reveal the strength of its people. They came not with fury, but with focus. Towering shapes rising from the horizon, creaking with every foot forward. They were not men. They were machines. And their sole purpose was to unmake stone. This is the chapter of siege engines. The silent beasts of war that turned castles into memories. The rise of siege engineering. In the earliest sieges, brute strength was enough, battering rams, ladders, maybe a fire or two. But as castles became more sophisticated, walls taller, gates thicker, defenders craftier, the attackers answered in kind. Thus began the golden age of siege engineering. A science of destruction, rooted in geometry, weight, and woodcraft. Every siege became a workshop. Every battlefield, a stage for monstrous invention. The trebuchet, the king of gravity. If the catapult was strength, the trebuchet was elegance. Standing stories tall, this counterweight-driven machine hurled stones the size of oxen, hundreds of feet through the air. But it was not just size that made the trebuchet fearsome. It was accuracy. A good crew could aim it with surprising precision, smashing the same wall section again and again, until the crack turned to collapse. And they weren't limited to stones. They threw fire, rotting carcasses, even messages. The trebuchet was not only a weapon. It was psychological warfare. You could hear it before you saw it. And by the time it fired, you prayed the wall held. The battering ram, the beast at the gate. The battering ram was not subtle. Shaped like a lock often capped in iron or shaped like a ram's head. It was suspended on chains within a roofed wooden frame. Teams of soldiers rocked it back and forth, driving it again and again into castle gates. Every thud was a countdown. Every splinter, a warning. To defend against it, castles added murder holes. Slits above the gate through which defenders could drop stones, boiling water, even molten lead. Still, the ram persisted. If the gate fell, the siege changed in an instant. From a slow game of attrition to a brutal flood of swords and flame. The siege tower, stairways to invasion. When attackers couldn't break the wall, they aimed to go over it. Enter the siege tower, a rolling fortress of timber, as tall as the walls themselves. Inside, stairs or ladders wound upward. At the top, a drawbridge, ready to drop onto the parapets like a deadly handshake. Under cover of arrows and smoke, these towers creaked forward inch by inch. Inside them, soldiers waited. Tightly packed, sweating, silent. When the bridge dropped, they poured out like water. Victory or death was only a step away. To counter siege towers, defenders lit them on fire, or built moats too wide for their wheels. Still, many reached their targets. And when they did, the real siege began. Ballistae and catapults, the medieval artillery. Some siege engines didn't just attack walls. They hunted people. The ballista, resembling a giant crossbow, fired bolts the size of javelins, with terrifying speed and accuracy. It could skewer multiple men at once, or target a knight atop the battlements. The catapult, powered by twisted ropes or torsion springs, lobbed stones and fireballs in high arcs. Less precise than the trebuchet, but faster to build and deadly when used in numbers. Sometimes a siege engine would sit on either side of a field. Defenders launching from towers, attackers firing back from wooded ridges. It was less a duel, and more a dance of destruction. The psychology of siege machines. It wasn't just the damage that siege engines inflicted. It was the dread they inspired. Watching a trebuchet being assembled was like watching a gallows rise. Hearing the thrum of a ballista meant someone near you would die. Seeing a siege tower inch closer each day was a test of nerves and will. These machines made time into a weapon. Each hour without relief added to the pressure. They were as much psychological torment as they were physical threats. You knew the enemy wasn't just waiting. They were building something, and it would come for you. The engine crews, architects of ruin. Siege engines didn't build or run themselves. Behind each one was a team: carpenters, engineers, ox handlers, and archers for cover. These crews were specialists, often traveling from battle to battle. They spoke a different language. One of levers, rope tension, and stone weight. Defenders sometimes targeted them specifically. A well-placed arrow killing a builder could set back a siege by days. But they kept working, day and night. Because once the engine was finished, it changed the battlefield forever. Defensive countermeasures. For every siege engine, there was an answer. Or at least a hope of one. Castles built angled walls to deflect trebuchet shots. They added wooden screens to absorb catapult impact. Moats grew deeper. Hoardings wooden extensions atop walls. Let defenders shoot down safely. Even then, it was often a race. Could the defenders adapt? Faster than the attackers could construct. It was a chess match played in real time, and every pawn was alive. Innovation through destruction. Ironically, siege warfare was one of the most inventive aspects of the medieval world. In a time when most technology moved slowly, the siege drove creativity. Every new castle defense birthed a new engine. Every new engine inspired a new fortification. It was destruction driving innovation. It wasn't just war. It was evolution. The machines that changed history. Some castles fell not because of treachery or starvation, but because of a well-placed rock. From a machine that took weeks to build and seconds to destroy. The fall of Constantinople. The siege of Acre. The collapse of Kenilworth's mighty gate. Behind each one stood not just men, but machines. Monsters of wood and rope, iron and stone. Not alive, but unstoppable. They were the embodiment of human will, shaped into something terrible and precise, and in the age of castles, they were the true kings of the battlefield. Victory in siege warfare didn't always come from battering walls or toppling towers. Sometimes, it came from silence, from waiting, and from what happened inside the castle. This chapter is not about armies or engines, but about the people trapped behind stone walls, slowly unraveling. As the siege pressed on, the true weapon, time. Sieges could last days, but more often, they lasted months, or years. No constant clashing of swords. No dramatic assaults each night. Just pressure. Subtle, Suffocating. Relentless. Time became a weapon sharper than any blade. And inside the castle, it began to do its work. Rationing hope, the struggle for food. The first signs of trouble came in the kitchens. Salted meats dwindled. Grain bins echoed when tapped. Vegetables spoiled or ran out altogether. Commanders rationed food. Then have the rations. Then have them again. Horses once majestic war mounts became soup. Dogs vanished. Cats were eaten quietly. And sometimes, there were whispers about meat that couldn't be named. The hunger stripped away class, title, pride. Knights begged. Children cried in corners. Mothers gave their last scraps to sons who wouldn't survive the week. No battering ram struck as deeply as the emptiness of the belly. Water and the wells. Food was one thing. But water was life itself. If a castle's well was inside the walls, they had a chance. If it wasn't, the attackers poisoned it or blocked access. Water barrels were rationed. 1 ladle per person. Sometimes less. People drank ale instead. Weaker, safer, but limited. As the siege wore on, thirst burned hotter than fire. And when it became too much, some tried to escape. To sneak out at night for a stream, a puddle, a hope. Most never came back. Disease, the hidden invader. As food waned and sanitation failed, disease crept in. The crowded living quarters, the rot of unwashed bodies, the stench of chamber pots. All fed the invisible killer. Dysentery, typhoid, plague. They moved faster than arrows. A sneeze could become a funeral. And when there was no strength to bury the dead, bodies were stacked in cellars, or burned in corners of the courtyard. The defenders' numbers shrank daily. Not from battle, but from beds. The siege of the mind. But the worst siege was the siege of the mind. As weeks dragged into months, hope began to rot faster than food. Soldiers stared at walls, mumbling to themselves. Mothers lost their voices from crying. Priests whispered prayers no longer believed. Some castle dwellers began hearing things, seeing things. Some simply walked into the courtyard and stood still as enemy arrows rained down. Despair did not come with a scream. It came with stillness. Leadership under siege. A good castle lord was tested not in feasts, but in famine. Some leaders shared their food. They walked among the people. They spoke with calm, gave purpose, reminded everyone what they were fighting for. Others hid in towers, ate better meals, tightened their fists and lost the loyalty of the hungry. Mutiny was not unheard of. Sometimes a castle fell not from a broken wall, but from a servant unlocking a gate. To end the suffering, siege was not just military strategy. It was psychological dissection. The clock of surrender. Eventually, the signs of collapse became clear. No more arrows from the towers. No torches on the walls. No movement, no cries, no life. A white flag fluttered. Or a door creaked open. Sometimes, surrender meant mercy. The attackers allowed survivors to leave unharmed. But not always. Some victors wanted blood, revenge, punishment. And those who had suffered the siege suffered again in its aftermath, when the besieged won. Yet not all stories ended in surrender. Some castles endured. Against all odds, they held firm until winter drove the enemy away. until reinforcements arrived, until the besiegers themselves starved. These defenders became legends. Their walls never breached. Their will never broken. But those victories, too, came with scars. Not all survivors celebrated. Some looked at the burnt fields, the empty halls, the mass graves, and wondered, was it worth its siege without glory? Unlike a pitched battle, there was no final charge, no heroic trumpet blast in siege. No thunder of hooves. No banners waving in the wind. Just waiting. Wasting. Weighing each moment against survival. Glory belonged to the tales written after. The real siege was slow. Personal. Agonizing. It stripped away armor. And left only the naked soul behind. Conclusion, the walls within. In every medieval siege, there were two walls, one built of stone, the other built inside the mind. The former was visible tall, strong, measured. The latter was invisible, and far harder to defend. Siege warfare wasn't just about breaking through walls. It was about enduring what happened inside them. And those who survived were never the same again. The end of a siege rarely came as a thunderclap. More often, it arrived quietly. Like the slow cracking of an old oak before it topples. This chapter is the final breath. The moment of collapse. The reckoning. Not just of walls, but of everything they stood for. The breaking point. Every castle has its limit. Stone can withstand fire, but hunger corrodes from within. When the final stores of food turn to dust, when the archers drop their bows from weakness, when the children's cries fade into silence. That is the moment when the gates tremble. Sometimes, it came with betrayal. A spy within, a desperate prisoner, a servant with the key and nothing left to lose. Sometimes, the walls were breached at last. A collapsed tower, a tunnel detonated beneath the keep, a battering ram striking its final, fatal blow. And sometimes, it was a surrender. A white cloth, lifted by shaking hands, not in cowardice, but in resignation. The entry. There is a strange stillness. When the enemy enters a fallen castle. No more shouting. No more warning horns. Only footsteps echoing off stone. And the rustle of flags being torn down. Victors tread cautiously. Uncertain what death traps may remain. The air smells of sweat, rot, and extinguished hope. In the great hall, once full of feasts, dust floats where sunlight pierces shattered windows. Tapestries hang in tatters. Tables lie overturned, as if the ghosts of the castle staged one final protest. The spoils of war. When the castle falls, so too does its treasure. Gold. Armor. Books. Silks. And the most bitter spoils. People. Nobles were ransomed. Commoners enslaved. Sometimes women were claimed as prizes, and children taken as hostages or heirs. It was not always immediate brutality. Some conquerors showed mercy, recognizing the castle's stubborn defense as worthy of respect. But mercy in the Middle Ages was not a guarantee. It was a coin flipped in bloodied hands. Justice and revenge. The fall of a castle was often followed by trials, or what passed for them. Defenders were paraded, publicly punished, or executed to send a message. The lord of the castle might be hanged from his own battlements, or spared, only to live out his days disgraced. And when the siege was personal, when vendettas or betrayal burned hot beneath the armor, retribution was swift and merciless. Revenge lit fires long after the siege engines had gone silent. What remains? Once the victors left or settled in, the castle bore its scars. Scorched gates, cracked towers, catapults left broken in the courtyard, like the skeletons of giant beasts. And those who returned, if they ever did, came back to ruins, to walls that whispered, to stairways that ended in air, to silence so deep, it could hollow out the soul. In time, weeds would grow between the flagstones. Birds would nest in the broken turrets. And future generations would pass the ruins, wondering what stories they once held. A new banner. But not every fallen castle was abandoned, some became strongholds for the conquerors. New banners were stitched, new coats of arms carved into the gatehouse. Children born inside these stolen walls would never know the siege that made their home possible. Victory rewrote the stone. And the castle, once a symbol of defiance, became a throne. The cost of triumph. But make no mistake, even the victors paid a price. Their armies were thinner, their coin purses lighter, their morale frayed. They had seen too much, smelled too much, and they had learned that even the strongest walls only delay suffering. Behind every conquest was a graveyard, sometimes visible, sometimes buried inside the minds of those who survived. Echoes through time. Hundreds of years later, you can still walk among these stones. Castles now visited by tourists. Once echoed with screams, commands, and silent prayers. The moss-covered ramparts, the arched windows, the spiral stairs. They remember. They don't speak. But they remember. They remember how it ended. Not with glory, but with exhaustion. Not with song, but with the sound of dust settling. Final reflection, siege as symbol. The fall of a medieval castle was not just a military event. It was a psychological unraveling, a study in endurance, power, and loss. It was a war not only of armies, but of wills. Of faith. Of hunger. Of the terrifying question, how long can we hold on? And when the walls finally crumbled, what was left was truth. The end of the endless siege. You have now walked through a world of towering walls and broken gates, of boiling oil and silent hunger, of glory and ruin. The medieval siege was not a single battle. It was a theater of human extremes. Pain, pride, cruelty, courage. It was the long, slow grinding down of everything a castle was meant to protect. But it was also a testament to resistance, to innovation, to the enduring power of belief. Because no wall lasts forever. But neither does the siege. Somehow, always, the sun rises again. Even on the ruins.